Good evening and welcome to this evening's discussion on democracy and disinformation. It's part of the Democracy Week of events in Geneva. And we're very happy to be able to host a panel of four speakers whom I'll introduce to you in a moment. My name is Shalini Randeria. I direct the Albert Hirschman Centre on Democracy here. I'm by training an anthropologist and a sociologist, and I'll be just moderating the discussion. So among the questions which we hope to talk about today is the question of media and disinformation. Because as you can imagine, a free media and a public sphere in which there is exchange of views and of information is something which is a foundation for liberal democracies. What we have seen is a shift, if you like, from older kinds of propaganda to disinformation in an age when there is actually a flooding of the public sphere, both real and virtual, with a surfeit of information. So it's with the rise of populism, or we can ask ourselves the question, is it a chicken and egg question? What is the causal relationship between populist politics and fake news and disinformation? How do they feed one into the other? The other question, which I think interests all our four panelists, is the question of how affect is related, how emotions relate to the kind of social media use that we are seeing, and why, instead of a rational deliberation, as we would have expected after Habermas, what we are getting is more and more of hate speech, more and more speech which is hurtful, which is intended also to not only defame but to also spread actively disinformation on these media channels. So those are some of the kinds of issues we hope to discuss, from broad general questions of what is populism down to what are the kinds of strategies as we as citizens can use against to counter populist disinformation campaigns. So let me just briefly introduce the four panelists. Let me start with, in the center, we have a guest from outside the Institute, Arana Antelo. She is a European law expert who worked at the head of the legal department of a software company before she joined the European Commission. She's currently advisor to the Deputy Director General for Research and Innovation for Citizens, covering citizens' involvement in science and innovation policies. So actually, with concerns that are very close to the heart, both not only of this debate, but to ours as a research institute as well. It's your first visit here, so a warm welcome not only to Geneva, but to the Graduate Institute. And we hope that we will be able to hear something about the kinds of policies which the Commission is putting into place to involve citizens and to have a more inclusive citizen participation all across Europe. Next to her is my colleague Leander, who is a professor here at the Graduate Institute. She's a professor of international relations and political science. She, before she moved here, she was teaching at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro and has had a long and distinguished career across European and American universities. So I'm not going to go into the career trajectory, but just to, I think, make the point that Anna has taught in very diverse and interdisciplinary settings, which really marks her own scholarship on the question as well. Her current research focuses on politics of digital aesthetic and legal practices. She's been working on cybersecurity, on social media, and on digital security. Her research is actually, if you want to define a very broad field, it's in international political sociology. So she's close to the sociology department's concerns on these questions as well. Next to her, my colleague, Mohamedou, who is a professor of international history, trained both in history, political science, but also as a lawyer. He currently chairs the Department of International History at the Graduate Institute, and both Anna and Mohamedou are faculty associates at the Democracy Centre, at the Albert Hirschman Centre on Democracy. Again, somebody with a very long and a distinguished academic career. He was scholar in residence at the Harvard University Center for Middle Eastern Studies. And here also, I'm not going to chart the trajectory, but to say, I think there are a few of us who have one distinction which Mohamedou does, and which is he did leave academia in between to join politics. So he has real experience of real world politics, unlike the rest of us academics, and he had a stint as a Minister of Foreign Affairs in Mauritania before returning to Geneva as Academic Dean of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. He's been working on questions of political violence in the Middle East, on transnational terrorism. His latest book is called A Theory of ISIS, Political Violence and the Transformation of the Global Order. And of course, he's been working on questions of democratization in the Middle East. Last but not least, next to me, Flavia Kleiner, who just informed me that she's finished her studies. So we should give her a big hand. And not that she probably would have needed a training in history in order to do the work that she's been doing, but she is a historian, a lawyer turned full-time political activist who co-founded Operation Libero, which is a transpartisan political movement here in Switzerland. She studied constitutional law, also philosophy of law, contemporary history in Fribourg and in Jerusalem. But I think what makes her career really distinctive is the fact that as president, co-founder, co-president of the Swiss liberal movement, Operation Libero, it is thanks to their really effective and innovating campaigning strategies that in Switzerland, we have seen the successful defeat of 7 consecutive referenda by the populists in the country. So it's the national conservative agenda of the Swiss People's Party, which they have challenged and challenged extremely effectively. And therefore, I think one of the things we hope to learn from her today is how to build up a movement from the grassroots. What are the kinds of strategies which can be really effective in countering disinformation? And interestingly, so of course it's about political mobilization, but it's also about discursive strategies. And that's, I think, a really key insight which we have from Flavia's work. So let me start first with a very global perspective before we enter into the nitty-gritty of populist politics, the major question. So what is populism? Why is there a resurgence of populism globally? And so we first clear the conceptual terrain before we enter into some detailed questions. Mohamedou.
Thank you very much, Shalini. Good evening, everyone. Many thanks for taking the time to be with us this evening, and my thanks to Shalini and the center, Christine, all the team with them. It's a real pleasure to have this conversation and welcoming as well our guests, and a pleasure to be here with everyone. In these opening remarks, I will make ever so briefly 3 points. The first is on the history of populism itself, because I think to the point you just raised, it's important to try to define the terms that we're going to critique, to unpack. Specifically, secondly, the disputed meaning of the term, and thirdly, the changing politics around its current use. So, on to the first point. I'd say that once upon a time, that would be your 20th century, the term populism was essentially a pejorative one. It was essentially associated with the notion that populist parties in practice were to be dismissed from a sense of a proper political governance option, proper here being in the sense of generically accepted as such. They would be looked upon very paternalistically, both by the elites who themselves decried, but also in the study of these things in academia and generally. These movements were seen primarily as being predicated on a notion of demagoguery, essentially, that this would be how the populist leaders that moved them would speak to the masses, quote unquote, addressing them in generic terms that are often emotional terms to our topic as such, moving them in the name of ideologies that tended to be quite very much what we would refer today as identity politics. Populism would be therefore during that period and for therefore quite a foundational moment. It would carry, therefore, in my view, a sense of DNA of it, an association with patriotism, with nationalism, and therefore opening the possibility of a connection with extremes in that sense that they could lead to either on the right or on the left. Historically, the most consequent period of such populism would span, as I said, late 19th century to the 1940s or so, mostly. They would be, therefore, importantly, the byproduct of the first wave of democratization, historically, that arose. And I think being simultaneous with the, secondarily, with the Industrial Revolution, they would also carry a sense of a class issue associated with that, which echoed their own elite discourse. And so also logically related to places where the Industrial Revolution and sort of the storms that came with all of that movement historically was very much visible more than in other places. Russia, for instance, with the Narodniks, which is a term that literally speaks to the people. Europe, the Volkisch movement, of course, in Germany, the Boulangisme in France, and the United States with the Populist Party, using explicitly the term again, all of it leading to a high point in the 1930s, we would say, which interestingly also runs in parallel with three big movements that are not necessarily to be understood as populist, but also are happening as parallel stories. Communism, fascism, Nazism in these countries where these movements were active. You could say that there was then a post-World War II, post-decolonization slowing down of the movements, although I would hasten to say that the Cold War also gave a chance to many of these movements to reinvigorate their voices and their movements, particularly by associating it with a military phraseology that emerged. I'm thinking in particular of the John Birch Society in the United States, which is not often thought of as a populist movement, but I think when you look closely at their techniques, you would find that this was also present. Not to think fully of this in terms of the North, you could find also in many of the newly decolonized states a lot of the populist rhetoric, which the new regimes used to delegitimize any opposition parties very much in the name of that populist rhetoric, again, making use of nationalism as such. Since the 1970s, and this is now, I think, important to us, we're seeing a slow but gradual return, a comeback of sorts, of the whole discussion on populism. In 1969 already, Gellner and UNESCO are writing explicitly to that term, quote, "A specter is haunting the world, populism." We're in 1969. And you see then that since then, the average vote share for populist parties around, particularly Northern Europe, has been going from about, in different surveys, from about 4% in 1974 to close to 10.5% in 2012. A gradual, slow, nothing extraordinary, but quite important in the evolution. And since 2016, we have had most of these reaching at least 10% in the elections, which is therefore cementing as an issue. My second point is that conceptually, therefore, because of this history, the term has remained loose. Now, that's what it is. We have to work with it. We don't necessarily see that as a problem, but in trying to understand it today, we have to see that it opposes fundamentally the people to the elite. This is how it's been presented and practiced by the people that try to present a purer version of politics versus, quote-unquote, the corrupt elite as such. And therefore, it would seek to present itself as a more democratic version of democratic politics, for that matter. Not that it is necessarily, but that's the narrative that you see. Again, I highlight the class dimension. I think it is important because it's presented in this versus elitism logic. But what that does, however, miss on Shalini is that you get a sense that a lot of the discussion tends to evade, consciously or unconsciously, the fact that the people themselves can be anti-democratic. And that is an issue that has not necessarily been covered enough in the discussion about that. There's one fellow that has done a lot of work on that, a French political scientist, Guy Hermé, who has a bit of a trilogy on this, Le peuple contre la démocratie, Les désenchantements de la liberté, and Democracy et autoritarisme, which he goes and addresses this a little bit more. And I think it's interesting to see the work that he develops there, which is that the real Democrats can in many times and in many places be a minority as such. Populism has also been equated with chauvinism. Nativism, issues that are coming back, protectionism, when we look and bring the question of the economics of it. And in a way, paradoxically opposed to pluralism, in the sense that its voice is the right one, not necessarily an acceptance of other voices for that term. It is also problematically not necessarily always a proactive movement. It's oftentimes an opposition movement that sets itself against, contra mundum, contra other versions of what it is, and therefore carries an undertone of mood, of anger, of resentment as such. My final point is that, and it's the one I really would like to highlight, if I may, is that today, in spite of this history, which has the advantage of a certain linearity and clarity, I think today in the 2010s, the term is experiencing a problematic, nuanced, elusive reappropriation. What do I mean by that? In fact, so much so that there's a lot of subjectivity onto the semantic dispute. You could say that it's becoming, populism is on its way to suffer the undesirable fate of the term terrorism, that your populist is my anti-system advocate, increasingly. You get the subjectivity a lot. What do you mean by populist? And that is raising all manners of unclarity, which we need to tackle in terms of the research and in terms of the debate. It's because it's become a repository of all manners of dystrophies, political disenchantment, democracy fatigue, mistrust in institutions, urban anxiety, rural loss, communal tensions, identity struggles, and more than anything, it presides over what we clearly see increasingly as the retribalization of politics. And so, for sure, the widespread failure of officialdom and elites gives it a lot of momentum around the world, from Egypt's Sisi to Washington's Trump, but you get a sense that that dispossessive neoliberal corporation authoritarianism is not necessarily always the mainstay of it, that you're having now new, perfectly fine on their face, legitimate populist movements. Think about Les Gilets Jaunes, think about Ciudadanos in Spain, that can carry an undertone of other darker themes as we look closely to what they are currently showing. And so for me, demonstrably, populism has been built on an exclusionary logic. It rests fundamentally on that. The Populist Party, by the way, in the United States in the 1900s was in favor of the Jim Crow laws. Earlier, in the 1850s, another party, interestingly known as the Know-Nothings, I know, it's interesting. They changed their name subsequently, became the American Party, was advocating explicitly white supremacy and was opposed to immigrants and Catholics at the time. And then we come across regularly the intersection with that. Recently in Britain, with anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiments as well, amongst many, in France as well, in Spain, amongst many self-proclaimed populists. We can see this Front National, Pegida, Germany, of course, Syriza in Greece, others. But there's also a very interesting, because the term is, as I said, so open now to interpretation and dynamic, you're seeing new entities. I'm thinking about Vox in Spain, for instance, that appears essentially as an anti-inefficiency in the system kind of logic, but then gradually is more and more carrying other politics under that echo what I was describing. And you see that, of course, in Sweden, in Denmark, Belgium, Netherlands, Austria, as such. So, in closing, I would say, however, that nowhere is the current whitewashing of populism, pun intended, more encapsulated than in Donald Trump. And what by that I mean that you have here an eminently member of the elite, essentially the product of Hollywood, of Wall Street, of a friend of the politicians, parading and managing to be elected on a populist ticket, essentially, a platform pretending to be anti-system. And I think what that has done, above and beyond the specific tiring and tired Trump story, I think what it has done is that it has kick-started, essentially, a movement that is muddying the waters. What are we looking at, as I said? Is this populist in a sense that we can clinically identify this and study it, or are we looking something that is in flux, in movement? And therefore, I think what we need to do, and thus the value of this conversation, is to recapture that the narrative on that, which has become the monopoly of this remixing of the term, as I said, and so as to be able to then address the second part, I think, of our conversation, which is the notion of what to do about this in terms of the citizenry of it. Thank you.
Thank you for this global overview, also for the conceptual clarity. Let me move to Leander. We'll go in the order in which we are, to talk more specifically about strategies in the use of social media to counter populist politics. And then, of course, we'll talk about the distinctions between left and right populism in the kinds of questions which you would like to address. So I'll let each one of you go for 7 to 8, 10 minutes, and then we can just have a discussion amongst you. I'll just prompt you with a few questions.
Super. Yes. One of the things that's happened with this problematic reappropriation of the populist term is that a lot of attention has been paid to the form it's taking and the way that this reappropriated populism is playing on emotions and on affect, as Shalini said in the introduction, and we're all interested in this. We've had a lot of attention to the role of deep fakes in the media, the false news, the way that this has been spreading. And I want to talk a little bit about the ways in which this is actually being resisted rather than the ways in which it is being done. And I want to talk about the role of platforms. And in order not to make it completely abstract, I'm just going to start with a couple of conceptual things. I want to link it to one specific right-wing populist case of reappropriation of this, which is Bolsonaro in Brazil, and the way that people have reacted against one of the very, very many. It's like all of these movements. It's like Trump. It sort of throws at you every day. But of course, one of the things was in connection, and that's why I put this picture up. I think it's impossible to talk about social media without showing the pictures of what I'm talking about. But anyway, that's why I want to take up. So one of the things that Bolsonaro declared, of course, was that the NGOs were, it was their fault that the Amazon was burning, right? And so I want to use that and the way that has been resisted to talk a little bit about the role of and the possibility of actually playing or using social media to resist this kind of thing. So first, just a couple of basic points. So one of the things that's happened is that we've had to rethink what we mean by political communication in relation to the populist movements. And Shalini mentioned Habermas and the conventional view on politics as being about public debate that takes place in something like the Greek bull, where you have people who are empowered to do so, presenting special kinds of arguments. And maybe this was never quite how politics worked. Like maybe it was never actually about this. Maybe it was always about emotions and sense-making more broadly. So maybe we never did politics only by reason. That would have been very nice. It's Habermasian kind of ideal situation. A lot of the focus on conventional political theories, my background, as Shalini mentioned, is in political science. But maybe, we've known for a long time, at least, well, maybe since Aristotle, actually, and the discussion about Greek politics, that it's also about sense-making in a broader way that engages the embodied, that engages not only reason, but also vision, but even worse, not only vision, but also what we hear and what we sense, what we touch, what we smell, and so on. So maybe we should always have thought about that side of politics as well. And of course, anyone who's seen Leni Riefenstahl's films and read a little bit about what preceded the rise of fascism in Europe will be aware of the role that this plays. So maybe we always thought politics also through the body and through the skin. Now, one of the things that happened with social media is that it became almost impossible to pretend that that was not true. And so people have been paying attention massively, of course, because what happens when you communicate by social media is that the images and the sounds and their haptic quality, their capacity to grab you, is constantly present. And of course, it's not only present for the right wing, it's present in all the populism, it's present in all online politics. So we need to become a lot more astute, actually, in thinking about this and move. There's a German sociologist I quite like, Hartmut Rosa, who's written a lot about resonance. So the idea of moving from thinking politics as being mainly about reason and reasoned argument to something that works largely through resonance. And that, of course, has all kinds of unpleasant implications, but maybe we need to wake up to that anyway. So just to then, that was what I wanted to say. So maybe we should always have done this, and maybe we need to really move there. And I'm very happy to come back to what that means in conceptual terms in the discussion. But I just want to say, okay, so then what does that mean? So a lot of people have been saying that the right wing is so good at this. They're so good at playing on our emotions. And Leni Riefenstahl, she set the model for what's been pursued ever after. And of course, with social media, much more strongly so. And sorry, one point that's really important about social media. Social media is social, so it actually enrolls you actively, which I think gives sort of you enact the politics as you're part of it. But of course also resistance against various forms of populist arguments is using this massively. I'm just going to give you some examples in relation to the Bolsonaro and the burning of the Amazon. Of the way this is being organized. So one of the most obvious ways it's being organized is through the way that marketing works. And one of my concerns with the way that people think about how politics works and social media works and how the effective side of this is the tendency to exclude the branding. But of course, branding also of NGO politics and of the very important work they do in countering something like Bolsonaro's claim that they're responsible, is that they're engaging the whole machinery that they actually have for branding their own activities. And in so doing, of course, they give voice and give visibility to what a lot of people are experiencing and showing. And I have the picture here of an alliance of NGOs that organized a protest that plays on the idea of the community that is facing Bolsonaro in the Amazon and beyond, connecting to... Did I put this on? No, I didn't. Anyway, I had a picture of sort of NGOs linking up to this with Ireland, but I can see it doesn't. So it sort of travels and it links people up to broader community in their protests. Now, of course, this poses all kinds of problems, obviously, what the branding does to the NGO and their activities and what this means for their identity as representing people, but also, of course, who speaks for whom. And so should the most branding capable people be the best suited to lead resistance in a case such as this? So but it's something that's going on and it's something we need to engage. A second kind of activity that goes on in something like this is the mobilization of celebrity activism or brand, but celebrity aid, celebrity humanitarianism. So basically celebrities of various kinds, and here you have an image of a range of Brazilian artists that engaged against the burning of the Amazon, but also, yes, exactly here, Sting, classic on this, who sort of picks up the issue. And again, place, of course, it links to emotions of very complicated kinds. It links to music that people identify with. It links with awe. It links with admiration. It links with associations that are positive for a lot of people. But again, raises all kinds of interesting issues politically. So are these people really the ones that know the best about the burning in the Amazon? And are they really the ones we want to be there? And what's the cost of it? But it's also something that's going on. These activities, Sting is making declarations about the Amazon, and the Brazilian artists and singers and so on are mobilizing massively on social media on this issue, partly because of its transnational nature and so on. Third thing I wanted to raise in this context, sorry, just need to, yeah, exactly. The possibility of using humor and satire in this kind of situation. And I think the use of memes, so this is where the enrolled part and sort of user generated kind of activities become really, really important. And these are taken from basically off the internet, and it shows sort of putting together of different kinds of images. And I took them partly because they also illustrate the problems with this. So as you see here, if you look on these images, these memes that I've put up there, they fit, a giraffe figures very prominently. And the reason for this is that a poor YouTuber who sort of activated herself against Bolsonaro for the Amazon had drawn a giraffe. And then that it became a sort of common theme, deviating the debate. So the debate was just as much about ridiculing this YouTuber who thought there were giraffes in the Amazon, as it was about actually, engaging the various issues that the Amazon was raising. So use of humor and so on. And we all know, right, that the satire programs have more viewers than the news channels. So, using memes, using humor, using satire to communicate about politics online really is a very, very important source of information, formation of public opinion and public thought. And then, sorry, too many things here to juggle. Last thing I wanted to show you, the use of selfies. So the completely unmediated, I've gone from the NGOs to down the line to user-generated, entirely user-generated. So people posting images of themselves and their own thoughts and their own engagement, in this case in the Amazon conflict, as a very sort of important part of what the media opens up in terms of playing on emotion and our personal engagement with a political issue such as this, which of course also raises a number of very interesting political issues. And here you see, if you look at this image, you see that there are an enormous number of mobile phones held up to picture. So of course part of what this does, it becomes part of the creation of an identity. We all live partly, or many people live partly online, posting their activities and so on. But to the extent, so I was participating in demonstrations in Rio this summer, and I think there were more people filming the demonstrations with their mobile phones than actually taking part in it, in a sort of hope that this would somehow provoke political action. So there are all kinds of interesting issues, and so to sum up, that I think these strategies open. So I'm saying they're there and they're very important. They work largely through effective processes through the non-articulated. All of this is largely non-articulated. But it's not a panacea, but it's something we need to become much better at taking into account when we think about how politics works and the politics around populism especially. Thank you.
So, thank you, Anna. Let me remind you, we titled this evening's discussion using a quotation from Flavia, which said, "Populists don't have a monopoly on emotions." And this will take us back even to a much more fundamental point you're raising about politics, as to whether we misunderstood the nature of liberal politics at all, when all of these years in political theory we framed it in terms of just rational deliberative discourse in the public sphere, and underestimated the role of emotions fundamentally, so that it's not just populist politics, but there is an underbelly, or not even an underbelly, there is a constituent element of politics, which is emotion. So Martha Nussbaum's new book, Political Emotions, makes this point in a very interesting way, saying that liberal theory has made a foundational mistake in this regard, which needs correction. But before we come to that, because that's something which I think Flavia's work also engages with very directly, let me first turn to Arana Antelo from the Commission, and in view of your own work and the Commission's work in trying to involve citizens more broadly into political participation and interventions, if you can give us some sense of the kinds of activities which the Commission has been trying to promote, and the kinds of policies and the kinds of resonance, to use Hartmut Rosa's word, the kind of resonance here which the policies have had across Europe.
Thank you very much to the Democracy Centre, to yourself, Shalini, for organizing this one, for inviting us. As you have said, I am working in the Director General for Research and Innovation in the European Commission, part of the European Union. And of course, everything the European Union has ever done is always for the people. But indeed, like everywhere else, recently there's more awareness and more highest political priority given to really involving people also actively, not as passive recipients of whatever policies we develop. And this was the case in the past commission that is finishing now, and already the President-elect Ursula von der Leyen has said that this is going to be really a high priority. So maybe first very briefly say what we are doing in my own Director General, that can be maybe a reflection on what is being done elsewhere, mutatis mutandis. So we do try indeed to involve citizens. First, on priority setting, we try to what we call engage citizens, trying to find out their opinion. What should it be that we should be doing in terms of policies or in terms of research and innovation funding? So this is what we call engaging citizens. We also tried to promote education for science. And it has a link to some of the subjects as we are discussing it here, because it has a link to fake news. So educated people in general, in science, but in general, are better able and equipped to deal with misinformation. And by the way, I also use the opportunity to say that we are also trying to promote science in gender, in girls, promoting science education in girls. So we are also trying to involve citizens in the scientific research as actors, like not only defining the subject that we should be research, but also cooperate in either collecting data or even more closely in the research itself. And there's been reluctance by researchers to do this because they thought this was unnecessary, a nuisance, and they didn't see the value added. But even now, European organizations have developed training programs for researchers to do so, and the researchers themselves are recognizing this. At the end of the day, there is value added brought. We are also trying to use citizens as data collectors. They can collect data now with our own smartphones about their own body processes, for instance, or about the environment. So they are really important actors in science and research. But maybe if you allow, I would like to explain a little bit more of what the European Commission is doing in general to tackle fake news. I mean, the European Union itself has been a target of fake news for such a long time. But twice it became important recently. You said it very well at the beginning in your introduction, Shalini. I mean, now everyone is involved, the whole society, and we have the IT tools. So it's become a very important quantitatively, it's changed the quality. So it can influence political processes. It can change the quality of our democracy. It can manipulate democracy. So this is all very serious. So the European Union is doing many things. On all accounts. The idea is not only to tackle the fake news in and themselves, but also to work with all actors around it. So, of course, we are trying to identify fake news concerning whatever subject, but also the European Union itself. We have created a database where all these fake news are posted and people can check this online. I mean, you have been used to hear all kinds of strange things, sometimes things very difficult and sophisticated, but sometimes simple things like your favorite food is prohibited. The European Union has just forbidden your favorite food. And people say, no, and they hate the European Union for it. All kinds of strange things. So now we have a big database at union level, but also smaller databases in every member state in local languages, with the fake news or misinformation that has been identified. We are also cooperating with member states very closely on various subjects, on elections organization, to make sure that elections are organized in a reliable and transparent manner in which private data are respected. We are also we have created a network of member states' information system, rapid alert system, to inform about fake news being identified before they spread or while they are spreading, so that the member states can act and stop them from spreading. We are also working actively with online platforms, and that the Commission has encouraged big online platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Google and others to develop and sign and commit to a code of conduct in which, a series of things are specified, like identifying fake accounts, removing them, identifying fake content, removing it, etc., etc., and also identifying politically financed or driven accounts, and then watch what is happening there, and so on and so forth. The code of conduct has been signed this year, so at the beginning of the year. So we are actively following up as a Commission what happens here. We are also promoting quality journalists. You mentioned journalists at the very beginning. We are promoting quality journalists. We are also trying to empower people to be more alert, have a critical mind, and also by simple means, like we all can be actors of fight against misinformation. Whenever we see something, we can react. So we are trying to promote this. We have done many, many events with people to promote this. What else? Then maybe if you allow, because I come from digital research and innovation, we are also funding a lot of research on these subjects. Like, for instance, how do automated processes work? How do misperceptions work? Or how to identify fake news, visual, written, Maybe I would like to mention one example because it concerns Switzerland, where we are. We have funded researchers from Switzerland coming from Lugano UC, so University of it's Italian Swiss University, or yes. And they have developed an algorithm, very interesting. They have got 4 grants from our European ERC, Research Centre, 4 grants, and they have another source of financing. They have developed a very interesting algorithms that spots fake news within hours. They claim between 2 and 20 hours, like 97% of fake news are identified. And they are not looking at content, which is very difficult to do, but they are looking at the way the news is spread, which is apparently different. Fake news is spread different from real news. And it's really a very successful algorithm. So you can Google it. They have even created a company to commercialize this algorithm called Fabula. It's a company. You can Google it. So these are the kinds of things that we are doing. So working on the highest level, working across member states with all actors, but also working at very technical and technological level. So, and maybe last small message, I would like to emphasize that indeed we are all actors of the fight against democracy manipulation.
So thank you very much. I think we'll come back to a couple of points. I think the education point which you made is interesting because what we are seeing in all the polling across Europe is that education levels of those who are supporting populist parties and voting for them are very, very different from those who are not. There are interesting gender differences as well. Men supporting much more strongly populist parties in European elections in almost all countries as compared to women. But the second point which you make, I think, is also interesting because across Europe, actually the EU has been a major target of the right-wing populists. Brexit would just not have been possible without fake news about the EU. Which was one of the major campaigns of disinformation. The only problem is, and I'll come back to that, and I'll ask you a direct question on this, if one is working with governments, one is in real trouble, because you have Orban and Johnson, whom you will have to work with, who have been the chief architects of these kinds of populist attacks against the EU. So I think we will have to empower citizens against their own governments when it comes to support for the EU. And this, I think, would be an interesting political process. Let me turn to Flavia with 2 thoughts to focus your discussion, but feel free to say whatever you want on it. One is, I think, what is very interesting in the work that you have been doing is your own use of the most modern technologies of memes. So you are combating the opponents very much on their own territory on which they have had a lot of success. But one of the other things you've done is what you call strategic framing. So it's not just the question of branding, which Anna raised, but Flavia and her group's work shows the importance of turning around the framing of these discourses and why that is such a key issue in the strategies of citizens to combat right-wing, especially right-wing, but could also be left-wing populism. Yeah. I think it doesn't matter whether it's right or left-wing here. I think it's a question of combating of disinformation and populist campaigns.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Shalini, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. I would quickly start by saying that Operation Libero actually wants to defend liberal democracy. That's what we're here for, that's what we want to do, and that's what we think is at the center of all these issues. And that's also where we think that serious Democrats should have a strong interest in actually building a profound understanding of citizens on what institutions do for them, why they matter for them, for all of us, and why it's worth protecting them. And many things play in what we've heard just from you, Anna, that like liberal education is such an essential component of it. And what we try to do by our work is actually really, keep up this work of sort of education as well, through modern tools and campaigning techniques. So just to quickly focus on what you've mentioned already, Shalini, and I make one point before I go into these aspects, because to us it's really important to not only be a force that counters, first of all, right-wing populists. We want to actually promote a positive vision of the future, a vision which is inviting, which is inclusive, which is here for an open Switzerland, like what we call Switzerland as a land of opportunity instead of an open-air museum, as many political forces here in this country, and especially the right-wing populists, want to see it. A country that cannot be touched or changed, or anything that should be closed against this globalized world outside and any migrants coming in, whatever. No, we see Switzerland as an open country, as a progressive country, as a country which is looking forward to the year 2050. So, and from there, basically, I want to share just one strategic aspect, which is the framing point, and one is about the tactics that you already elaborated really interesting points about, and some of them we actually pick up in our campaigning work. And about the strategy, I think one of the most important things is that we don't focus on the already convinced. You know, we don't want to focus on, I'd say, rather progressive, left-wing people who are convinced of this world vision we actually have for Switzerland, but it's rather, I would say, on a bit conservative, middle ground, bourgeois, voters. So people who would maybe even have an open ear to the messages and the frames that come from the right-wing populists, because they feel a bit insecure by this globalized world, again, by the immigrants, and they need to hear a different vision. And so we try to actually focus on these people and to get to talk to such voters, basically. And then if I speak about framing, what I mean by this is actually, and maybe it's the best if I explain it right away with this one vote we had in 2016. Some of you might remember it. It was called the Initiative de Mise en Œuvre, or the Durchsetzungsinitiative here in Switzerland. It was about actually expelling so-called criminal foreigners, that's how the right-wing populists called them, for even minor offenses of law, like driving 2 times too fast within 10 years. And you must know, maybe some of you also don't have a Swiss passport here, just being here in the country, you could have been, a victim of this new law. And also with you, other people who live maybe in 3rd generation in this country, who have never lived abroad, but they as well would have been expelled for such a minor offense of law. So we knew that the right-wing populists, of course, they want us to defend criminal foreigners. I mean, that's a super lost position. You could never get out of it. I mean, you would be the one who says, oh no, but that's not so bad what they did after all. And they can say, you're defending criminal foreigners, how dare you? And that's a super catchy message, right? The right-wing populists wanted to present to the Swiss people. And actually, it's even more tricky, because the Swiss would have voted on a group like the foreigners, which themselves could not even take a position on it. So it's even more tricky. So the basic thing was, how can we convince the Swiss? How can we make them aware that actually it's about them? It's about their rights. It's about their institutions. How can we convince them about this? And that was basically, I think, the decisive framing. We said, hey, right-wing populists, you're coming over here and you're explaining to us why you are about to attacking Swiss fundamental rights, the Swiss institutions, like rule of law, because that would be it. If you reduce, for example, the room for a judge to take a decision and take in consideration personal hardship, that's actually what rule of law is about. And by this initiative, that's what you're cutting out of the Swiss system. And that was a really patriotic way to argue as well, because we said basically that's what is so important in Switzerland. Our constitution, our institutions, the fundamental rights. And that was basically how we managed to turn it into an uphill battle for them, for the right-wing populists, because then they had to somehow explain to the people why they are about to attack rule of law here in Switzerland, right? So that was the biggest compliment that the right-wing populist leader, his name is Albert Hirschman, made after the vote when he told me, I don't know what happened, but at some point everybody spoke about rule of law, you know, and I thought, yes, framing, check. So that was actually the most important moment of this vote. And also to just give you an illustration of how we try to illustrate this whole idea, is that we used the Helvetia, which is the allegorical figure of the Swiss. She's on every coin and so on. And she's like the representing, like she's representing the Swiss institutions and values. And we showed how she would be smashed away by a wrecking ball, which actually represented this initiative in its cruelty, in its, So that was the whole narrative that we framed. And I just gave this one example about this, and maybe to come back to also tactics, how I would call it, what you, Anna, elaborated more before. I would definitely share with you that that's how I put it, you can be popular without being populist. You can find a language which speaks to more people, which doesn't make you automatically a populist, because I'm also more with your definition, which is a much more, I think, analytical one. But still, I also say that in today's world, it's a media society. I mean, if I prepare myself for a speech, I invest 50% of my time in the content I want to present, but just as much time in how I put it, how I tell the story, because that's just the way you get through to people today. And to give you another example, if with my organization we want to bring something to the broader public, for us it's very clear we don't need to publish it in the Entität. I mean, it's a super smart newspaper, you know, they bring in very complex arguments and so on, but it's a tiny minority who reads this newspaper every day. Les 20 minutes, 20 minutes, that's the newspaper everybody reads today. It's a quarter of the Swiss population who commute every day from A to B. That's where you need to get to, and actually to page 1, 2, or 3. That's the reality. And if you want to get there, you need to be able to put your message in 1 picture and 5 words. Voilà quoi. That's the way it is. And as you said, you're actually in concurrence with the cat video on social media. So your video cannot be that complex, and it must be funny as well. And that's what we basically try to do. And if I just might come back to this, or give you maybe one more example just about fact-checking, because that's also an important aspect. Where memes come in, Anna. So actually we had this Extrablatt, which is sometimes when the SVP, and that was also in that vote, she already was a bit desperate, it seems to me, because she then sent out to 2 million households the so-called Extrablatt, which is like a short newspaper full of headlines, you know, and statistics which are somehow, you know, weird and so on, and titles like Eritrean rapes girl, sort of, yeah. And then that was in every newspaper on a Saturday. On Sunday, we sat together and thought, what are the 10 biggest lies in this newspaper? We wrote it down, we made memes with it, and on a Sunday night, we sent it out to all the Swiss journalists, like a media, you know, announcement. And the following week, the newspapers were full of fact-checking the SVP. So basically, the journalists then started to do their work again, if I might say, because they actually then, they went back several years and they checked, okay, these statistics were wrong too, and right, nobody controlled it, and yeah. And that actually damaged the credibility of this party a lot. And for us, it was such an important post on Facebook. It reached around 1 million of people in Switzerland in the end. So, because people really got the point. And these memes that we create, they put the message really, again, in this one picture and some words, you know. So our activists on the social media, which are called the online warriors, sorry for the wording, but they go out and they fight back the trolls. That's what they do. They are going out there, they're arguing, and they put out these memes, so people get the argument really quickly. So just a quick overview. I'm looking forward to the debate, and thank you so much for your attention.
So, I'll just basically pass on the word to you to say, do you want to pick up any of the points from each other's presentations? I have a series of questions, but the audience probably also has questions. But let me first go across here and say, would you like to respond to something?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of things that have been said, which I think give us a full picture of where we are. It's one of the things that just listening now to you, Flavia, and congratulations for the very important work you're doing. It's really nice to see both the reaction to what I think is the main problem that we have in many of these questions, which is the apathy that have really descended in many places. I think this is one of the problems that we have in terms of not realizing that the value democracy has to be nurtured. Mm-hmm. So it's very easy to point out to dystrophies once they materialize and to finger point and to have particular actors that are pushing their agendas. And that can be dealt with. And I think this is the better way to do it, as you just said, which is to recapture the terms of the debate, to redefine them, to be precise, to be engaged, everything you listed. But I think at the end of the day, where the problem really rests is essentially, why did this materialize in the first place? How come we are today having this conversation? Mm-hmm. I think when you look at that, then you see that it's kind of a perfect storm of this. And again, back to Trump, it's no surprised that this particular individual comes to become the president of the United States in 2016. There's a sequence that leads to that. I think there's a bit of an impoverishment in the terms of the debate, which is really gradual. We know we've been talking dumbing down since the 90s. There's the quality of the attention span. There's the deficit of what we're looking. This comes from lack of investment in education, lack of the quality of it, sort of all of this building up. So by the time you get to having that message beamed in the way it is by someone like him, you already have a population that is ready to receive that. That's one. Secondly, I think that populism, we spoke about it a lot here today in the context of a northern, Western, European, shall we say, North American context, but it's actually a global problem. You kind of started alluding to that earlier when we brought in other geographies, but this is an issue in the Philippines, in Egypt, in Turkey, in Brazil, in the United States, throughout Europe, in parts of Africa. This is running in parallel with the neo-authoritarians that we see. It's not always there, but it is important to see that this generation of leaders that are able to speak in that language are able to do it in Saudi Arabia, in the very manner in which one speaks on behalf of the rights of women, supposedly. I don't know that you can brag about giving women the right to drive, about an achievement, but that's what it was presented initially before the horrible Istanbul story behind that. So it is in this logic of speaking a certain language that is received also rapidly by the media again, and then when the deeper issues are reached, then you feel like it's too little too late to address that. My third problem with this moment is that you now have movements, as I said earlier, that are recapturing the notion. I think this is really the challenge. It's more conceptually a problem. It's less of an issue sort of operationally, what we heard. I think there the logic is exactly as you said. Engage, go exactly as you said for the centerpiece of the political and the social aspect. But conceptually, then we're entering here a discussion where what are you to say if women say, well, actually, I have a right not to like, blacks, Jews, Muslims, fill in the blanks for whoever you don't like. It's an opinion, right? And so you get into this logic where things that earlier were centerpiece of rule of law, right? Matters that were actually criminalized in many of these societies become a matter of subjectivity. And I think once, this is basically the sort of the genius, the evil genius of Mr. Trump, is that he has opened the Pandora's box for that. Mm-hmm. And so now we have to go and recapture that terrain so that populism, which is what I mentioned earlier, was simply a member of the family of the political spectrum, is not necessarily simply the opening to much darker themes, and we've seen that. So that's why the parallel we get all the time now, are we back to the 1930s? Because this continent went through that. all of the 1920s and 30s were about the rise of populism, 1.0, before it got to where we are now, and we know what came after that. And I think this is why this conversation is very important in terms of the segments of it. The what has to be done at the level of international organizations, regional organizations, the work that has to be done in terms of pushing back, and that's what it is, but also proactively being there before it materializes. And sort of letting not that degenerate to a point where voter registration now is redefined in a country like the United States. For instance, if you don't have your name spelled exactly to the letter how it is, and we know how mistakes happen in transcription that are not necessarily yours, but the computer's, you're off. And that has led to thousands of people off of the registrations votes, which happen to be 60 to 70% African American, for that matter, unsurprisingly. So you get these correlations between these questions. That's what I picked up from my colleagues, and I think all of these points are exactly the conversation we should be having.
Yeah, thanks. So very nice points, and I'm not going to repeat them. I think we could all raise a number of issues, but I'll just point to two things, maybe three, that I think are very important. And it's just to complicate the discussion a little bit. I suppose it's the academic default or something. And the first issue I want to raise is the problem of what happens when we educate people and bring citizens in and, start creating awareness about the lies. And of course, don't mishear me. I'm not saying this is necessarily to be rejected. I lived in Denmark before I came here. There was a weekly show that specialized in taking the lies out of the media and so on at prime time Sunday night. The problem is just that what tends to happen is that you lose trust when everyone becomes a sort of forensic expert, checking the evidence of everything. You generate a sense of distrust of everything. And there's always, in the day and age of social media, the possibility to click on and look for more information, more verifications, and to question. And this, I think, has very problematic effects for politics. And I just want to raise them, not under the banner of saying let's not do that, but just what happens when we start distrusting everything around us. It becomes the apathy that I think Mahmoud was very right in bringing up. I think it's partly linked to that, to the sense of, well, I don't really know, and there are 1,000 contradictory pieces of information out there, and I can click and I can add, so it becomes 1,001. Not talking about Arabian Tales or something like that, but still, this is a real problem for contemporary politics. And another real problem for contemporary politics is the issue of truth. So trust and truth. Because of course, scientists actually disagree. And a lot of issues, it's not so easy. It's not just black and white. And one of the things that's happened with the focus on fake news and the distrust in facts is that we've entered an age of nostalgia where, people look backwards towards the good day and age where experts told us what was really the case. Now, anyone who's done a little bit of thinking about politics of the past should be aware that that's a very, very problematic age to be in. That was an age where, we defined things about, natural things about women, race, gender, that couldn't really be raised because factually speaking, the scientists of the time agreed that they were not to be raised. So it's actually very, very important, I think, not to give in to nostalgia in politics and nostalgia about, the ultimate true fact that we can all easily recognize and allow space for a critique. And we've seen intellectually, but also politically, a move backwards. Scare. We're facing something we all think is deeply problematic, the specter of the 1930s, you just evoked it, etc., but also the specters of what we're being told we're heading towards. It's it's pretty grim. But I just want to sort of make a comment on that I think it's very important to reserve space for critical thinking. And that doesn't necessarily mean non-liberal thinking. You know, Kant was a critical thinker of the early day and age. But it means preserving space for actually questioning supposed unanimous facts. Yes, and I think I should probably... The third point I was going to talk about is... I think so. All of this is going on, and I don't think there are easy solutions to these things, but I want to throw them into the discussion. I think in terms of we actually also need to be attentive to what we do in terms of trying to find solutions, because of course every solution we find comes with its own problems, and that's the sad thing about life, that usually things are a little bit complicated. And so when we build up, Anna, I think you're doing very important work, and I'm a great admirer actually of the work you're doing in the unit. But of course, when we do things, and we do it all the time because we have to, in politics people have to act, there's Hannah Arendt or something like that. We need to think carefully about the implications of what we're doing. So when we're putting an algorithm in charge of telling us about truth, and we're trusting it, a technological fix, what is that actually doing? We need to think about those kinds of things. What are every country, the EU, and your unit, a representative of it, but also companies, also NGOs, etc. Everyone is developing policies and codes of conduct to, in various ways, deals with it. And we have very little understanding, I think, of what this is doing to us politically. And so I suppose the third thing I want to plea for is openness to actually processes that allows one to come back on and rethink this. I think we need to do things. We don't have of course we're always doing things, right? Also non-action is a way of doing things. But just the importance of that kind of process. Thank you. Sorry, that was too long.
Well, we'll go into with the Q&A into the audience in a moment, but Anna, maybe you'd like to respond to some of the points. I think one point which I would pick up is the question of the code of conduct in the companies, because I think the technology itself is part of the problem. So it's not like we didn't have disinformation before, but the means of spreading it is much, much faster, and the linkage, therefore, to action is much faster, because you can incite many more people to convene to Tahrir Square, but you can also incite people to violence much faster. So I think the speed of the technology itself is a problem. The nature of these algorithms is a problem on both sides. And I'm always sorry, as somebody who was an activist for many, many years of my life, I'm always worried when we are asking companies to self-regulate, because codes of conduct and self-regulation can only exist if they know that there are serious sanctions for those violations. Because otherwise, by self-regulation, you are not going to get these technological companies, which are part of the problem, to become part of the solution. So I really think you would need regulation besides self-regulation. And these companies have been very averse to regulation, because we should not forget what Mohamedou has done very well is to, sorry, all my notes are flying, is to historicize the question. But I think here the history matters. Google and Facebook, etc., have all come up in an age when in the US, antitrust regulation is at its lowest. They are all children, the Silicon Valley Revolution are all children of the Reagan era, where the US government is totally hands-off and is not regulating. So once you have this very serious weakening of antitrust regulation, you're in an age where these companies then have no oversight in the kinds of monopolies that they are able to build up. So having got that monopoly, I don't think self-regulation alone is going to be able to control them. This would be something that I would like to hear the views of the Commission on, both the way in which it can bypass some of the governments to get to the citizens, and how it could regulate besides self-regulation.
This is a very good question, and as I mentioned, all this is very new. What I can say is the response by the main platforms that I have mentioned, so the most known ones, has been very positive, and the commitments are very concrete and very with indicators to see whether they are really doing what they are committed to do. So the Commission is monitoring this. We are not even 1 year into this work. And after 1 year, there will be like a first report on what is happening. And this comes really, the timing is interesting because the new commission that is meant to start maybe in November, that has 2 declared priorities, like the, digital and also climate. So there is, I cannot tell today what is going to be that they are going to legislate on, but your things that you're mentioning is one of the possibilities. So whether this is working well and we don't need to intervene, or whether we need to reinforce something that is working well, or we need to impose something that is not working as we expected. So this is certainly going to be looked at. So you really have put your finger on something that is already being discussed, actually.
I just want to say, from the point of view of an activist, that's something we reflect a lot in my organization, because I really think we have a huge responsibility. Once you get out, once you get to talk to public, I totally see that there is a big responsibility coming with it. And so that's what we try to reflect on a lot. But maybe, let's open up to the public.
All the 4 questions on the table, just feel free to pick up whichever points you would like to, and that's then the final word which you will have as well.
Thank you. Very quickly, for the sake of time. Sir, thank you for your comments. There's absolutely nothing, I think, from the way I see it, controversial nor problematic in what you said. I think what we have been witnessing, and you said this rightly, is that you have had a lot of dogma in both the social commentary and in the international organization picking up on this. So your example, I think, is something that I witness on a daily basis, that a particular narrative which is not in line with something that someone has a particular argument to push, be there political, ideological, you name it, tends to be invisibilized. This is, I think, something that we witness fundamentally, and I think that is the crux of this discussion in terms of how to address that. So yes, absolutely, that would mean, to your point, that there is no monopoly on that. I should say in relation to that, part of the problem is also that it's oftentimes couched in emotional terms with a certain urgency. Which leads me to the comment by the gentleman. I fully agree with you, and I'm glad that you voiced it in those very terms, which I completely share. I think the complacency is an issue. This is too urgent of an issue. We have been sleeping at the wheel, and we wake up now. It's too little too late, as I said. Those that have something to peddle are doing very well, thank you, and everyone else is realizing that this is an issue. I think the problem there that I have is this is about the societal body. The cité has to address this. This is how politics were designed. It's not an elite, because then you can't have it both ways. You can't say the elite are doing this and then, oh, we want somebody to come and fix it for us. No, 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 it's up to you. And you have to go and fix it. And when there is popular activities, as we've seen, initiatives by the young colleague here, I think this is the kind of things we need more of in that sense. But I think what you said is absolutely that. And I thank you for the comment on the DNA of the so-called immigration problem. Migration, which is a right, has been now painted as a problem simply because we invisibilized that first part of the movie, which is that there was some stuff that was beamed over there. Now it's coming back too. So I think this is very important. Danielle, I think you're absolutely right. The media have not done their job. I think what we're seeing is fundamentally poor journalism. Good, solid, enriching quality journalism used to exist, and it changed history, and it was there, and we could rely on it, and we could get the analysis, not the information. Journalism as a noble profession. I don't see much of it these days. There's some of it, we have to look for it, as the gentleman pointed out, but it's too much work that I have to go and look for these sites, and for one site that I have to find, I am swamped by stuff that is not even just fake news, disinformation, it's actually just poor corporate material, infotainment we speak about since the mid-90s. And then today you have Fox, who does this, and then CNN, who does that. None of them is journalism. None of them. It is not about reporting the facts and then allow me to make my judgment on these matters. And I think these binaries, which you find around the world, are problematic. Quickly to your point, it's about funding. I know that journalists do not have that, are not able to do the work, and that is another project I think that has to be tackled. And I think I half addressed your point, which is, your point is your nuance is extremely important. Disinformation and misinformation, one is more active, the way I see it, than the other. It comes with a political agenda. And as I said, I think that disinformation is quite advanced. I think we have a problem now because that has moved in connection with what you were saying about the nature of the technology. I think the technology is taking a flight of its own. We knew that coming into this discussion a few years back, but now it's becoming a reality to the point that we don't even know how to respond to this. It's algorithms, as you said, and who's programming them, rather, you said, and how is that going to become something that we can address as such? I think that I will simply end with highlighting again the urgency of this question. I think this is good, but where are the people? Where's the engagement? Where's the protection of that value that you then come to complain has been taken away from you?
Yeah, thanks for the discussion and the excellent comments. So I'm not going to repeat what Mahmoud already said. I agree with everything he said, actually. I just want to make a couple of additional on the question of the quality journalism and its importance. So I don't have a solution. I just think it's indeed a very, very important social function and the noble profession that is really in dire straits. And I think it's actually worse than we often think because we're commercializing the logic of journalism and it's leading to a vulnerability to financial changes in journalism that actually ties it into both public and private powers from which it should be independent. Also because of the way we're running research and thinking about the risks of research, we're ending up with something very serious, which is big black holes in terms of knowledge, because no one will pay the insurance to go, and no company, so press company or television station or whatever media outlet, will allow their employees to go there. And we saw this, there's been a lot of work on this in the Syrian context and the difficulties of actually no one knowing and no one going in independently to work. And I also think there's an imperial side to this in the sense that we have some countries that are doing so. In the US, there are a couple of good outlets. We have a couple of good ones in Europe and so on. But of course, that's not good enough by any stretch. So I find it very preoccupying, and I don't know what to do. I don't think anyone knows, right? That's that's a 6 million question or something. The European Union is trying to partly compensate with the Plan S. So having independent research being publicly available, but that's backfiring in all kinds of ways. But anyway, it's an extremely important issue, so thank you for raising it.
I would like to say two things, maybe. Of course, as a civil servant, everything I say is always personal opinion. But now what I'm going to say even more. So two things, like reply maybe to your question on monopolies of emotions and so on, coming back to the title indeed. I thought it was very interesting that you both mentioned emotions. You said emotions are maybe carried by extremes, right and left. And then it's, I realize it's very often we associate the word emotion with bad emotion, negative emotion, like aggressive emotion. But the range of emotions in vocabulary is broad, and you mentioned that somehow, because you talk about artists and music and people like that. So it's also the positive emotion that is there in the center that also people relate to. is that maybe there are more women in the middle trying to more passively, indeed, less actively carry these emotions, or women or female energy, not necessarily women, men, like less aggressive men, or more aggressive people, men and women in the extremes. And I think you're right. Everything was always about emotions, and we notice it not only now in politics, but even relationships in society. It's always about emotions. Your message doesn't go through if it doesn't carry by an emotion, and the people the counterpart has to resonate somehow with that emotion. And we are learning that also in the European Union. We are trying to communicate in a different way with more stories that touch people, maybe less all-encompassing, but maybe more personal and people relate to. And then to reply to the gentleman that spoke about complacency and gave the example of migration, I think it's really interesting that when you see the historical evolution of the European Union, now the European Union is active, politically very active, with high priority on many, many things that you've had mentioned. It's like 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we'll be working about this. It will be having science fiction. If you say we will be working on migration, people will say that's impossible. This member states' exclusive competence, they don't want you to touch it. Don't put your fingers in migration. Then what do we need? Do we need to have people call it problem. This is what people call it, a problem. Is it a problem that everyone wants to come to Europe because they think that our model is better, or they are more poor or in danger in their own countries? It's a problem indeed, but maybe the problem is elsewhere that comes to our borders. So I think that you're right, we don't need to be complacent, but at the same time realize that a lot of progress has been done, and that the Commission and the European Union do react on that comes to us. So we all learned about at the same time about Oxford Analytica, and this is maybe the trigger of many of the things that are being done now. So I think we are really in a science fiction world in relation to what would have been thinkable some years ago. So I have a positive view, and it's not a complacent. So the European Union is reacting always to what is happening in difficult circumstances, because you have to know that many of the competences that people would like us to work on are national competences, and then you need to be confronted with a big problem. So for member states to allow us to act at the European level.
Yeah, so my maybe final message would be like a psychological trick for us. And I think it should be that we shouldn't be intimidated by the right-wing populists. It sounds really simple, but actually we are in the majority here still. And then don't say it because I think right-wing populists are stupid or idiots or whatever. You know, I don't want to put it this way. I just mean that we should get in a position where we think, okay, again, you want to change the system that we have right now, which is the system of a liberal democracy. So it's actually you to explain us why we should change this, because it brought prosperity and peace and freedom to so many people in the world so far. And I think this gives you a totally different feeling when you go into this fight, which is an important fight, and we should all fight it. So that will be my plaidoyer against this apathy, you know, and also against this, what I call a climate change in the elites, you know, and in the intellectual circles, because so many things are questioned these days, and I think questioning is good, you know. I think we should publicly discuss more things, but we shouldn't put everything in, you know, we shouldn't be open to challenge like every question, because there are some principles which are worth defending it, and we should be a role model in doing it. And that would basically be my final plaidoyer. Yes, maybe I leave it at that. Thank you.
So thank you very much for being with us this evening. Just two final remarks. I think disagreements are very much welcome and in order, but the fact that one has a disagreement doesn't mean that the other party is into fake news. I think it's the whole point of having a discussion is to be able to have a debate which can have emotions, because I think the to keep emotions out of debates is a mistake. However, I think there's a technological problem about emotions which we haven't addressed today, but which I just want to put on the table as the last word. Don't forget, the business model of Facebook and Google is to push people into extreme positions. Because the business model is, the more you have an echo chamber of extreme positions, the longer people stay on the sites, therefore the larger amount of advertising revenue you can get out of it. So the business model is one which is linked into, unfortunately, negative emotions, so that there is an amplification of negative emotions with a kind of, so it's not that the technology itself is fault, but the business model behind the technology is certainly pushing emotions in a certain direction, which doesn't mean they can't be countered. And so I would like to thank you very much, Flavia, for really coming up with a narrative and strategies for countering those. We've had complication in all the terms of the debate from Anna. We've had a historical deepening of the entire question of populism and of emotions in debates and in democracy by Mahmoud. And also, actually, we were quite European-centered at the moment, but Mahmoud reminded us very rightly so that all of these are at the moment global issues, and the linkages are extremely global. We need to think about that as well. And thank you very much, Anna, for having joined us here, giving us the point of view of the kinds of initiatives which the European Commission is engaged in, and we can only wish you success, both with regard to the corporations and with regard to governments. So I hope that what we will get is a larger empowerment of citizens, but actually in the end we can only empower ourselves. There is nobody who can empower us. So I think all of us need to get our act together as citizens and engage in the debates which are really called for at this moment. So thank you very much for being with us. And this is the first of our discussions to be continued. So thank you.